Um, our recording is now in progress, and so welcome to everybody. It's not unusual that when we do a series, we start out with more and end up with less. Things arise and conflicts come up, but as you heard me say on the video, this will be the end of our series from the lectionary, and next week we're going to begin our Lenten series called Scaling the Seven Summits. I'm going to say this again in worship, so sorry for being redundant, but the phrase seven summits actually has meaning beyond our Lenten series. And so I would invite you to look it up on your search engine sometime and see what that means. And that'll give our Lenten season a little more meaning for you. So today we are on a mountain, and we are at the Mount of Transfiguration. And as you heard me say, every year, the last lection for the season of Epiphany is the Transfiguration story. It works out happily. We have a 3-year cycle for the lectionary. We have 3 of the Gospels, each of which presents the Transfiguration story. Very similarly, somewhat different. And then likewise, the season of Lent always begins with the temptation story, another story that's told similarly, but somewhat different by Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so it's a nice transitional time for us. So we're reading from Luke chapter 9. Let's just jump right into it. Here's the text. Now, 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter, John, and James, and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly, they saw 2 men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now, Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. And while he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent in those days and told no one any of the things they had seen. Okay. Let's just start out with a question I like to throw out periodically. We just read the story, and after our study, you're going to go meet up with a friend for coffee. And your friend is an unchurched person for whom the word transfiguration or the phrase transfiguration story would make no sense whatsoever. So you can't use that phrase. And they're going to ask you, "Well, what have you been doing today?" And you're going to say, "I went to a text study, a Bible study at my church." So what did you read about? And how are you going to answer that question? What did you just read about? What are we studying? What's happening? How would you name it? I'd like to take just a couple minutes to hear some of that. And those of you on the Zoom, you can use the chat feature, and Jen will represent it. If you're not comfortable with that, just get her attention, and she'll let me know that you have something to say, and I'll be sure to make sure everyone in the room hears it. So what is this text about? Don't use the word transfiguration. That's a churchy shortcut that we can't use with someone who's not churched. We have to learn to speak in tongues. Yes, Les.
I came away thinking that this was not so much what was happening with Jesus, but what was happening with the disciples. This became their OMG, oh my gosh, why do we realizing who this person was before them.
Okay, so Les says he's hearing this story a little less about Jesus and more about the disciples having an OMG moment when they're finally recognizing in a new way who this person is. Thank you, Les. Jen.
The comment that he discussed a vision held by 3 of the disciples on a mountain.
Okay, so you tell your friend we discussed a vision held by 3 of Jesus' disciples on a mountain. Okay, so I don't know who said that, and I don't want to know who said that. Okay, because I want to say your friend's going to say, "Oh, it was a vision," as opposed to a thing that happened, right? So that's one way of representing it, and that may be entirely right. Or you could say we talked about a moment when something really weird happened on a mountain, which is kind of where Les was going. He didn't name it as a vision. I don't know how he thinks about it. He didn't name it as a vision, but he did name the impact that it had. So both of these first comments are really focusing on the impact of what happened there, either as a vision or as an OMG moment. Good. Anybody else? What would you tell your friend this was about if that word transfiguration just isn't a working term for them? Les hasn't been here for a couple of weeks, and he's not been able to use the chat function, so he just wants to talk a lot. Do you have something more? You look.
Well,
yeah.
This is not so much before their eyes as in their eyes.
Okay, so he's making a little definition, something not so much before their eyes as in their eyes. Okay, so again, kind of distancing whether there's some reality to the event or whether it is more of a vision, more of a subjective experience that the disciples had rather than an objective experience that they witnessed. Okay. Yes, James.
Jesus is suddenly more important and more mysterious than ever.
Okay. Jane says the story is about how Jesus is suddenly more important and more mysterious than ever.
Harder to explain. Mysterious.
Okay, so Jane, when you say she added harder to explain and mysterious, when you say harder to explain, are you thinking harder for Peter, James, and John to explain, or harder for Jane to explain?
Both.
Yeah, both.
Harder
Okay.
to write about as well.
Yes. Yeah, you need it. Sometimes you need the gift of tongues to tell stories about something that lies outside of normal human experience. And when I say the gift of tongues, what I mean is you just need language. You need a language that's not our ordinary, customary language for the extraordinary moment. Great. Anybody else have a take on that? Well, yes, Janice.
I have no idea if it's true or not, but I wonder if it's in part the fulfillment of something that has come before because of Moses and Elijah being brought into the story.
Okay. Yeah, so
fulfillment of something or
right. So Janice is raising the question, wondering if this event, this story, is in some way a fulfillment of something that came before because of the presence of Moses and Elijah. And we're actually going to look at that word fulfill in a moment and where it comes into this story, because I think you're on to something very, very, very important. However, it's the kind of thing that may not communicate to your friend over coffee if they're unchurched as much as perhaps Luke is trying to communicate to his audience. Yeah. But yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head. Well, let's walk through it for a minute and I'm sorry. Yes.
So there's some caveats at the beginning. That Jesus is getting clued in on what's in store for him, and it looks really weird to his followers who are there.
Okay, so with some initial caveats, someone is saying Jesus is getting clued in on what's ahead for him. And what was the second part?
looks really weird to his followers.
And it looks really weird to his followers, which again could either be Peter, James, and John, or Mark, James, Les, Shirley, Janice, Jen, and all of you, right? Yeah, it is. I mean, we have to accept the weirdness sounds critical.
Yes.
So I don't know if I necessarily mean that, but it is out of the ordinary. The extraordinariness of it. Again, we need voluminous language to name something that is outside the bounds of our normal experience. And so Jesus in this interpretation is finding out what's ahead. And that's focusing on the part that Moses and Elijah and Jesus are talking about what lies ahead for him. And it raises a question about our Christology. What you think about Jesus? Did Jesus come into this world with a fully mapped out idea of what was in store, what was going to happen, who he was, what he could do, fully divine in that sense of knowing everything, at least everything about his own life? Or, did Jesus grow into this self-understanding? And were there moments in the Gospels where Jesus kind of had OMG moments or aha moments and was like, oh, this is the cup that I've been given, huh? Those are two very different Christologies. And I think in some churches, we try to honor Jesus in such a way that we try to honor fully divine as a way of describing Jesus so much that we almost throw the fully human aspect of thinking about Jesus out the window. I don't know anybody who can hold both of those thoughts together terribly well. But when we speak of Jesus, let's cultivate the practice of listening to ourselves and to see, are we thinking of Jesus more in terms like we are? Or are we thinking of Jesus more in terms like God is? And I don't know that we have to make a choice, and I don't know that we have to achieve 50-50 balance. It's just a way of kind of exploring what our kind of triggered Christology is. Read a story like this. Do we say something like, Jesus finally reveals what he's really like and then hides it again for the rest of the story? Or do we say, Jesus realized that it's going to be a strong, long journey and is learning from Moses and Elijah? That would be a different way of looking at Jesus. I don't have answers. I just want to prod you a little bit when you read it to let those kinds of questions become part of your interaction with a text like this. So the setting in verse 28 begins with the phrase 8 days after these sayings. And again, I was really welcoming you when you see something like that at the beginning of a story to walk backwards and see what sayings we're talking about. Because the real question is the story of the Transfiguration. We can use that term because we're church people. The story of the Transfiguration. Is it a standalone story, or does it make a difference in how you read it if you say, oh, this is what happened after Jesus first disclosed to the disciples that he's going to die? If you hear it as a second wave following that disclosure, and we interpret Luke's opening phrase after these sayings, it's literally after these words. Does that change the way you read this story? Rather than simply being this kind of phenomenologically wondrous revelation of glory, it's a crucifixion event. because Jesus has just disclosed that he's going to go and die. And now in this story, he's talking about going and dying with Moses and Elijah. And we find out even further that it's going to happen in Jerusalem. So does that change the way you read the story by connecting it to the story in front of it? Have you ever noticed before that the Transfiguration story comes after Jesus discloses his death for the first time? I think that makes a difference. So let's, the two things is, as you read this story, I want you to go backwards and claim that previous part and see what the connection is. Let that be part of your reflection on this text. And the second thing is just make that a habit. When you see a text that looks like it's beginning a new story, but it makes reference to what happened before, stop, walk backwards, say, oh, this is what they're talking about. And let that shape the way you enter the new story, because that's what Luke is asking you to do. He could have easily said, one day, Jesus took Peter, James, and John up onto a mountain. And then suddenly you'd have a new beginning that doesn't have a necessary connection to what happened before. Okay, I won't belabor that point, but I think I'm going over it again because I think this is the first time I've paid attention to the precedent to the degree that I have now, that Luke is actually connecting this with the disclosure of Jesus' death. There are some mountain stories in Luke's gospel. I want you to be aware of those for a couple of reasons. I have the scriptures listed here, but I'll tell you what's there. In Luke chapter 4, verses 5 and following, there's a mention of a mountain because that's the Luke temptation story. So the temptation in Luke happens on a mountain. The next reference is Luke chapter 6. It's there that Jesus goes to a mountain to pray. He goes to a mountain to pray. And just like the beginning of this story. And then he calls his disciples up and names 12 of them to be his, what we call apostles. So that's happening in Luke chapter 6. In Luke chapter 19, the triumphal entry story, when Jesus comes into Jerusalem, it starts on a mountain, the Mount of Olives, which is not it's no Mount Everest, but it's an elevation. And it starts there, and he comes into Jerusalem from there. Chapter 21 says every night Jesus would go back to the Mount of Olives and stay there. He wasn't staying overnight in Jerusalem. And then chapter 22, again, Jesus goes to the Mount of Olives, which Luke tells us was his custom in order to pray. And that prayer is the prayer where he says, God, if there's any way, let this cup pass from me. So these are significant moments in Luke's gospel. And it was in looking at that I kind of came across the idea for our Lenten series, scaling the 7 summits. I didn't want to do it from Luke's gospel for a couple of reasons, but I wanted to pay attention to the mountain stories, not only in the Gospels, but we're going to have 2 Old Testament texts as well, just to get the significance of what it means to be on a mountain. So that's something you can follow. So those references I gave you on your handout will really kind of give you a nice little journey through the mountain stories of Luke. So let's talk about the story that's hard to explain, the part of it that gets us. Jesus' face becomes other. Luke is very vague about that, right? It's just the word hetero. He doesn't say his face shone like the sun, like Matthew does. He merely says his face became other, or our translation says changed. If you hadn't read Matthew, what would you imagine that means? That Jesus' face becomes different, other.
He's showing them how otherworldly he really is.
So maybe Jane says he's showing them how otherworldly he really is. So maybe there's nothing to say beyond other, because there's no frame of reference, right? So I've told this story before, but bear with me. When my nieces were little, they reached that point where everything was by analogy. You look like a monkey. You laugh like this. You do that. You do, and everything was like something. So they were making. It was kind of interesting to see how they start making the connection of a new thing with an old thing, so they can understand it. Precisely how we would tend to think. And I had kind of longish, big hair at the time, and a rather full beard. And after my shower, I just was playing around and took my mom's hairdryer and blew my hair out really long and my beard out like that. And I came out and said, "Christy," you know, and she goes, "Uncle Mark, you look like, what do you look like?" She had no frame of reference. What do you look like? Like you have to look like something, right? And Luke has no frame of reference, perhaps. His face became other, different. I can't even explain it. That's a real option, is maybe Luke is reaching the end of his language in telling the story and can't really describe what Jesus' face looks like. There was a tradition that I think shows up in the gospel, in the New Testament a couple of times, of the harpy, which initially would be this beautiful bird-like feminine creature that in a moment would just turn from being beautiful to being taloned, fierce and ugly and a hag, and murderous. So there is a tradition. I don't know. I'm not pretending Luke's leaning on that tradition, but there is a tradition of things that can suddenly become completely other. That is very surprising, not what you expect. But it seems significant that Luke doesn't try to define it too much. That's a good lesson for me, that sometimes you don't have to mansplain experience, you know, and be, sometimes it's okay to say something happened and leave it at that. So the first thing Luke says is Jesus' face became other, and then his clothes became dazzling white. It's kind of an interesting adjective that's hard to translate precisely. Almost, it could be sequins, you know, it could be just shiny. It could be any number of things, but it's, you understand that this was a time when people's robes were almost always dingy, unless they were really, really well off and didn't have to go out into the fields and didn't have to walk far. They could be up in a, you know, a shoulder hosted ride or something like that. So it would be very odd to see someone in a pure white robe, much less one that seems dazzling like that, especially after they've just climbed a mountain. So it's kind of powerful language. And I think what we're aiming for in Luke's gospel, I think what Luke is aiming for is the word glory. Glory. So when you hear the word glory, which I hardly ever hear people say it in Presbyterian churches, they say it a lot in Pentecostal churches, especially Southern Pentecostal churches. Oh, glory. You know, that's a real phrase, and it means something. The pastor I had used to preach, you know, like hour-long sermons. At least it felt like hour-long sermons. And he would get going sometimes, you know, he was a dear man, and just get all excited. And sometimes he'd stop and just go, "Well, glory," you know, and everybody would, "Woo." But that was his way of just kind of signifying that he was really invested in a very exciting way in something. So what do you think when you hear the word glory? Do you ever use it? And if you do, what do you mean by it? How about on the Zoom there? just give us some one-word responses of what glory might mean to you, and I'll field that from the room. What's glory?
I think a beautiful day, lots of sunshine.
Okay, a beautiful day and lots of sunshine. What do you have, Jen?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I saw something pop up. That was you asking people. Okay.
God is close.
God is close. Let's come back to that in just a moment. That's
The
great.
thin place.
Yeah, that's what I was going to come back to. Jane just used the phrase thin places, right? That's a phrase that comes to us from kind of contemplative spirituality studies and actions. And it signifies that the space between heaven and earth, or human and divine, is very thin. Some people I know feel like the Iona community in Scotland is a very thin place because it's a community there that does a lot of contemplative prayer, and from which we get all these great taizé choruses. And when they go there, they feel like, they've really had a stunning experience. And it doesn't have to be loud and raucous. It can just be really quiet and so forth. The whole idea is that you just feel that close, right, to the divine. What else? What do you think glory? Hop on the glory train. What does that mean? Full of power and glory.
Outshines the sun.
Outshines the sun. I've got a home in glory land that outshines the sun. That's where that phrase came from. And yeah. So imagine outshining the sun. That's again, it's almost like my niece saying, "You look like, what do you look like?" It's kind of like the sun, but greater than the sun. And how do you describe that? How do you name something like that? Anybody else want to? Yes.
When I hear the term glory, I think of preaching in African American churches, which I've done on occasion. And in the midst of my sermon, that phrase comes.
Right. Right. So
one place.
Yeah.
But the other place that Jane triggered, the thin place, I remember a backpacking trip up in the Sierras and sitting by a lake, just sitting back, contemplating.
Right.
And it was again one of the oh my gosh moments.
Right. And what it was where? Up in the what?
In the Sierras.
Sierras?
Up
Yeah.
in the Sierras.
Okay, so Les is remembering two things. One is his experience of preaching in African-American churches, and much like Southern Pentecostal churches, because the worship experience is very similar, someone will shout out glory in the middle of a sermon, especially if you nailed it, right? And they will shout out glory. Another is, in terms of a thin place, remembering a hike up into the Sierras where it was just overwhelmingly lovely, right? And of course, this is where we get the language, probably based on this text, of having a mountaintop experience, right? You just, everything changes from there. Okay, let me get Jane first and then we'll go.
And you're sitting next to the bristlecone pine. That is the ancient tree. They keep a secret as to where it actually is.
Okay.
But it is old. It was, they figure it sprouted at about the time of Christ.
Okay,
It's
so
the oldest living thing that science is pinpointed.
okay, so up in the Sierras, the bristlecone pine,
The bristlecone pine is still alive.
still alive, perhaps the oldest living thing. Yeah. Okay, at least 2,500 years. That's amazing. That would be the Sierra version of Moses and Elijah. Seriously, it connects you to a history that you can only imagine, and that's pretty powerful. Shirley.
2 words from glory, glorious. I think we use glorious more than we use glory.
Mm-hmm.
And then Gloria comes from our voice and our singing. There are
Right.
lots of great songs. It's Gloria, Gloria.
Right. So Shirley's pointing us to the other forms of the word glory, one being the adjective glorious, which, we might sometimes use just to say really pretty, but we kind of preserve it for stunningly beautiful kind of a word. And the word gloria, which is a Latin term for glory, which has made its way into much of our music. And so we're going to sing Gloria, Gloria in excelsis Deo. We're saying glory in the highest. Glory to God in the highest, which is part of our Christmas story. This is what the angels are singing over the birth of what some people would consider a bastard kid in a stable with no home, whose parents are so poor that when they go to offer an offering for him instead of a lamb, which is the option for poor people. So you've got this moment that for us may look like full of humility, and you've got angels, angels for crying out loud, singing Gloria in Excelsis Deo. Of course, they didn't sing in Latin. Glory to God in the highest. There they are. So what's important about that, Shirley, I think, for me, is that it's not just a moment where everything is hunky-dory. It can also be a moment that looks incredibly humble and kind of a struggling people. But it's the presence of the Christ that makes it a glorious moment. So kind of an interesting thing. To you is born this day in the city of David, which is a cow town, a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. Okay, so we've got this mountaintop thing. Anything else, Jen, coming along the way you want to recognize?
Just musing on how the morning glory flower might fit in.
Oh, the morning glory flower. Oh, that's kind of interesting. And they have muffins called morning glory, I think, which to me is a little diminution of the term, but that's just me. Okay, so the phenomenal part of this story, epiphenomenal, noumenal part of the story, is that something really beyond explanation is happening. And all the words that are used are just kind of aiming for it and falling short, because it's kind of, there are words that intentionally point beyond themselves. And that seems to be what Luke is engaging with. But in verses 32 and 33, I think this is very interesting that Luke talks about how sleepy the disciples are. And it really triggers something that Luke is a lot more complimentary of the disciples than Matthew and Mark. Matthew somewhat, Mark not at all. We did a study of Mark, and we saw over and over again how frustrating the disciples were to Jesus. They didn't understand. They did not understand. They didn't understand. They didn't understand. 3 times when Jesus discloses that he's going to die in Mark's gospel, on all 3 occasions, 1, 2, or more of the disciples respond inappropriately. It doesn't happen all the time in Matthew. Doesn't happen all the time in Luke. So there's an underlying argument in Mark against the disciples, and I think it's very serious. If you take the shorter original ending of Mark's gospel, the angel tells the women, tell Peter and the disciples to go to Galilee. He will meet you there on the mountain as he told you. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were terrified. And it stops. That's the original ending of this story. There's been another happier ending tacked on. But in none of the Gospels do the disciples go back to Galilee. They end up, in the book of Acts, you remember it starts with them in Jerusalem. it may be in Matthew's gospel that they go back to Galilee, to the mountain. I'll have to look and see. I don't want to overspeak. But in Mark's gospel, Werner Kelber says that from Mark's perspective, the disciples failed. And his gospel is written to a different kind of piety that is not apostle-centered and not Jerusalem-centered. But if you read the book of Acts, it sure looks like that's where the early church gets its going. And if you read Matthew, what we call the Great Commission, you shall be my disciples, and you shall make disciples in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. No mention of Galilee, which is where Mark's angel told the women, you're supposed to go and meet Jesus. So very different. When you read Luke's story, Luke's version of events, he seems a lot more understanding. I don't want to say he's making excuses. I don't know I don't want to pretend there's a truth out there and either Mark's skewing it in this direction or Luke's skewing it that direction. I just want you to see the difference. That Luke says they were somewhat sleepy. And there are terms that are hard to translate. The word for sleep is P-N-E-U-A, something like that. And so apnea is an English variation of that word with the prefix A, which means not sleep, right? You have sleep apnea, you're not sleeping at certain points. That's the term going on here, the pnea term. And I'm sure I don't know how to pronounce it. And Luke wants to attribute some kind of sleepy stupor to Peter, James, and John. If you read it in Mark, they're not sleepy. Peter just blurts out and ruins everything. And when Peter blurts out, well, that's when Moses and Elijah go away and the voice smacks him down, says, this is my son, listen to him. Boom, nobody's there anymore. In Luke's gospel, Moses and Elijah are leaving. And then Peter says what he says. And Luke is frank that he doesn't understand what he's saying. But just he doesn't understand. It's not, who can understand an event like this? So just those shades of how they tell the story differently kind of gives you a sense that Luke is more invested in the ministry of the apostles. And if the same person wrote the book of Acts, then it would appear that that's because after the ascension of Jesus, it's the apostles that continue to carry on the gospel of Jesus through the power of the Spirit in the book of Acts. So as I said, these terms are a little hard to translate, not just for me, but for for good translators. Because if you read various translations, they just really struggle with exactly how to say this. They're sleepy, or possibly they could be asleep. And they are either waking up because they're asleep, or they're sleepy and now they're fully awake. So the terms can go in a couple of different directions. But my point for you is that when you read Luke, let Luke tell his story. He's attributing something of a sleepy stupor to the disciples, as opposed to, just Peter being loud and impulsive like he often is. Okay, and Peter offers to build 3 tents, 3 dwellings. That's the word skena. I'm convinced that the word skein comes from that, a word which our knitters will know really well. Kind of a veneer cloth or something like that. Etymology.com doesn't agree with me, so I'm probably wrong. It's sometimes translated skins because a lot of dwelling roofs and stuff would be made out of animal skins. It's the Greek translation of the Hebrew story of the Festival of Booths. So you might remember that, like, once a year, the Jewish Collaborative of Orange County will set up a booth in our grassy area here, and it's kind of a metal frame, but the whole point is it's got to have branches on the top. That's what makes it a legit booth. And it's for the Festival of Shavuot, or the Festival of Booths. We're actually going to have Rabbi Marcia here the week after Pentecost to talk to us about what the festival means, because that's the occasion that became the day of Pentecost in the New Testament. Yes, Les?
Peter's desire to put up the tents seems to me to be succumbing to the human propensity to, how do I keep this moment alive?
Yeah. So Les is relating that, and this is something you'll hear fairly commonly in commentaries and stuff, is that Luke's suggesting that we build tents is a way of kind of keeping something precious, almost by putting it in a container, as it were, and just hanging on to this moment. And who could blame him for that, right? You have that lovely mountaintop, thin place experience. You don't want to leave, right? And you just kind of want to hang on to it. So as Moses and Elijah are leaving, that's how Luke describes it, Peter wants to build these tents to signify this happened here and it meant something. And, you know, it would be the kind of thing that you could come back to time and time again and just relive that glory, as it were. Yeah, I think that's an incredibly human response. I think it's probably the best explanation of what Peter's thinking. And it should make us sympathize with Peter a good bit. Because if you don't stay there and hang on to that moment, you have to go where the story's taken us. And it's taken us to Jerusalem, where there'll be a different kind of experience waiting for us. So yeah, I think to that extent, we can all really sympathize with Peter and kind of understand why he would say that even so impulsively, especially since Luke says Moses and Elijah are departing at that moment. Okay, but then response to Peter, of course, is this cloud. Was there anything, Jen?
Just a quick question on Moses and Elijah. How did they know it was Moses and Elijah?
Look, folks, we are very biblical here at St. Mark. We have these little magnetic name tags. They had that in the New Testament. Every time someone from the Old Testament came out, they had a name tag and you knew who they were. I have no idea. But please don't lie awake at night worrying about that. This is a storyteller who is telling a story, and they get to tell it the way they tell it. If you want to go down this road, you can look at the history of iconography. I don't think this applies to our text, but a friend of mine, a Lutheran pastor, spent his sabbatical studying iconography. And when you draw Mark, the evangelist who did the Gospel of Mark, there are certain things you have to do. You are not freehanded to just draw what you think Mark might look like. There's a look. And if you're going to be a real iconographist, you honor that look. It's kind of interesting. I don't know who gets to decide what that look is. But there are iconographists who can look at an icon and tell you who it is without having to read the little thing on the bottom like I do. Because there's a certain look you're supposed to aspire to with certain people, at least within one school. How they knew, I have no idea. You'll have to ask Luke in heaven one day, because I don't think there's any other way to get to the answer of that question. But we have to accept the story that it was Moses and Elijah, and somehow Peter, James, and John knew it. But we're going to have to leave that. Yeah.
Well, how did Michelangelo know what God looks like?
Michelangelo does not know what God looks like, because I know.
But he captured it.
So the question is, how did Michelangelo know what God looks like? And everyone has to. I mean, first of all, one reason we're forbidden for drawing God is because no one knows what God looks like, and it's very odd to me that the drawing of God in the roof of the Sistine Chapel, as beautiful as it is, but yeah, I don't know. this is beyond us, and we're going to move on just for a minute, because I want to get to the reaction of God. The reaction of God is this cloud, and a cloud that overshadows him. So now you want to go back and look at a couple of things as you study this text. Clouds. What's going on with clouds? That's an interesting word. It's an interesting Greek word. There was a cloud that led the people of Israel by day, that then gave way to a pillar of fire by night. Okay, so what was that cloud? Was it just a little puffy white up in the sky? You know, I used to be able to name the various types of clouds, cumulus, or was it more of a, like when there's a sandstorm, there's a cloud that's just a small whirlwind cloud that is in front of people? We don't know. There's something about the cloud. Go to the Elijah story, read about the cloud. They're often accompanied by thunder. It's usually a sign of something. Read Exodus chapter 19. Exodus chapter 19. We always read Exodus 20 because that's where the 10 Commandments are given. Moses is, by the way, on top of a mountain. We're going to read this during Lent too. But don't forget to read Exodus 19, which describes what's going on there, because clouds figure into that story. So clouds often represent something about the noumenal presence of the divine, but it's kind of scary. And it reminds us that whenever angels appear in the New Testament, what's the first thing they always have to say? Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Because they're like these little ninjas that just pop up in the middle of the night and scare the bejesus out of everybody all the time. Because heavenly host means an army, right? These could be rather frightening creatures. So cloud, don't just think of a foggy day. This could be, we're on a mountain. This could be a sign of like doom or something like that. And then a voice comes out of the cloud. So now this voice is containing that unimaginable, undrawable image of God, right? God's voice is coming out of the cloud. I assume it's God and not Mary that says, this is my son, right? So God's voice coming out of the cloud. This is my son. And again, Luke says it differently than the others. Instead of my beloved, which is the language of the baptism in Luke, it's the language of the transfiguration in Matthew and Mark. This is my son, my chosen. So after that, then the cloud goes away, the voice goes away, Moses and Elijah are gone. It's just Jesus alone. So my question for you is, where is the epiphany here? If we're going to accept that this is an epiphany story, and you could say, well, I don't accept that, and we're done. But if we're going to accept that this is an epiphany story, is the epiphany when Jesus' face becomes other and his clothes shine in an almost impossible way? Is that the epiphanic moment when they finally see Jesus in all of his glory? Is the epiphany when the voice says, this is my son, the chosen? Does that change everything for you, for them, for followers of Jesus? Is the epiphany when they perceive that Elijah and Moses and Jesus are talking about his destiny, which is about to be, our translation says, accomplished in Jerusalem. That's a good translation. Could be fulfilled. It's the word fulfilled. I wanted to get back to from earlier, the pleroma word. His journey is going to be fulfilled in Jerusalem. Is that the epiphany? Is Jesus alone, after all the phenomenal things are done, Jesus alone, is that the epiphany? Is that now Jesus alone. After all of that, is that a different way of seeing Jesus, of Jesus revealing himself? So if you had to say it, that this is an Epiphany story, this is the last weekend of Epiphany, where's the Epiphany in this story? Besides everywhere. Did you ask the question?
Leaning toward the voice.
Leaning toward the voice. And you can go that way because that voice appears at baptism. The voice appears at the mountain of transfiguration, and I don't remember exactly which gospel. But there is a moment when God says, when God speaks after Jesus prays. It'll come to me in a minute. Where's the Epiphany?
It's such a happier time when Jesus has Moses and Elijah with him. And then they're gone, and then he's alone, and then the real setting starts. His aloneness is so tragic.
Okay. So,
especially if it takes us to the cross.
Right. So Jane is saying that the dynamic of the story is you go from this sheer, joyful, powerful moment of Jesus being with Moses and Elijah and the voice of God and transcending everything. And then it ends with Jesus alone, which she says is really a tragic moment because it's Jesus alone getting ready to go down from the mountain to accomplish what needs to be done in Jerusalem. Interesting. Anybody else have an idea of where the Epiphany moment is in this story? Okay, well, I thought you all knew the answer to that question, so I'm just going to leave it. I gave you on the bottom of the handout the parallel stories from Mark chapter 9 and from Matthew chapter 17. I think it's worth your time if the story really compels you to kind of do a little bit of a side-by-side reading of those three, if you can. It's often helpful to do side-by-side readings of these gospel stories from the synoptic gospels like that. Okay, that's going to be all we have time for today. We got started a little bit late, but we're going to end on time. Again, just because I keep saying this is the last episode doesn't mean we won't be back. We will be back next week. We're going to read Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 through 11, which is Matthew's version of the temptation story. One of our mountain stories will bring us back to the mountain of transfiguration in Matthew. So it'll be fun for us then to kind of notice some of the differences between what we studied today and what we're going to study then. I think it'll be about 5 weeks from now. So thanks everybody for joining.